Hi, my name is James McLoughlin. I'm a senior SEO consultant with Berlin-based search and content marketing agency Claneo, and today I'm talking about how to make your international SEO strategy a success. But first of all, why is this such an important topic? There's no one-size-fits-all approach to achieving SEO success in different international markets. You can't take what's worked well in the UK market, for example, and simply drag and drop that to another market and expect that it'll perform as well. Creating an SEO strategy for multiple countries and multiple languages is complex. Taking the EU and the UK as an example, in this region alone there's nearly 450 million people across 28 countries with 24 official languages. So if you're targeting even just a handful of these 28 countries, your SEO strategy has to be crystal clear to make sure that your users are getting the best user experience regardless of their location and their language, and to help search engines understand the different language and country variations of your content. One of the most crucial principles of a successful SEO strategy is that localization is greater than translation. By this I mean that simply taking a one-to-one translation of your content from one market and publishing it in another market isn't a recipe for success. In the worst case scenario, it can lead to mistakes like this, where the navigational elements have been translated from English, presumably using some kind of translation tool, and then not checked by a native speaker. The English word menu was translated to the German Speisekarte, which means the food menu that you'd get in a restaurant. This is a pretty extreme example and it was fixed pretty quickly, but it's a good example nonetheless of the pitfalls of going pure translation over localization. And even if you do use the correct translation, if you simply translate but don't localize your keyword strategy, you might miss out on potential in your international markets. A client we work with that sells pallet trucks, forklifts, that kind of thing, they translated their content into the different markets they operate in. And based on the translations, the focus keyword they chose for their pallet truck category page in Poland was Wojciech Paletowi, which is technically the correct translation. However, there's a more informal word for pallet trucks, Paletchak. This keyword and the plural version have more than 3 times the search volume for the formal translation, Wojciech Paletowi, and it's plural. If they'd stuck to a pure translation of their master keyword, everything would have been technically correct, but they would have missed out on a huge amount of potential available from the synonyms and close variants you can only identify with the help of local experts. This is why it's so important to localize your keyword strategy in order to understand local search behavior and to ensure that you're targeting all the relevant keywords and topics in your target market. And once you've identified the relevant topics for your target market and the local keywords associated with those topics, you should invest in quality, localized content. This increases your page's relevance to those important topics and keywords, but also builds trust and increases your perceived expertise with local users. If we take Urban Outfitters as an example, here we see their men's trainers page for the US and the UK. And down here they've got a small block of category text. In the US, this content is optimized for the keyword sneakers, and in the UK, it's optimized for trainers. And this is a pretty obvious example, but it demonstrates how, although you can have 2 pages essentially selling exactly the same thing, you can't simply reuse the content across multiple markets. If the same content appeared on both pages, a lot of UK users would see sneakers and think, maybe I'm in the wrong place, this must be the US website. And a lot of US users would see trainers and think, what the hell are trainers? And we recommend that you take this a step further and really localize not just the content, but also the user experience. So localize the currency, the sizing, the measurements, customer service hours, etc. Here we've got a product page from the fashion retailer Zalando from their German website and their UK website. For a start, the prices are formatted correctly for the target country, which seems rather obvious, but we do see from time to time, for example, European retailers whose UK website shows the pound sign after the amount, as currencies are commonly shown in European markets. Then a little further down in the size and fit section, the German page describes the model as being 189 centimeters tall, and the UK page describes the model as being 6 foot 2 inches tall. It's small details, but if this kind of information isn't localized to what the users in your target market would expect to see and are used to, it can affect whether your local users perceive you as trustworthy or authoritative in that market. And you can take this idea of localizing the user experience as far as you want, really. You could localize the navigation, so in December, winter coats and scarves might feature more prominently in the navigation of your Northern European markets, while on the Australian website you're pushing swimwear and flip-flops. Or you might consider selecting different review platforms per market based on the market share and the recognition that those platforms have. So for example, eCommerce and Trusted Shops are the market leaders in continental Europe, while Trustpilot and Bazaar Voice have a much bigger share in the English-speaking markets. So a quick localization recap: ensure that all of the elements of your site have been checked over by a native speaker, not just the SEO content, but also the simple navigational and template elements. And don't just translate your keyword strategy from your main version, but also localize it. Get native speakers from your target markets to review your keyword set for any missed potential. And once you've defined a set of locally relevant keywords, invest in great content that uses those relevant keywords. Don't just reuse the content from your German site on your Swiss and Austrian pages, for example, or the content from your UK website on your American and Australian pages. And finally, localize the user experience. Your users are going to be much more likely to trust your website and eventually convert if you give them a website that really feels local. So now that you've identified the relevant keywords for each of your target markets, you've written some great localized content for your important landing pages. Now you've got to make sure the search engines show the right content to the right users. And getting your hreflang implementation right is essential for international SEO success, but it's something that so often we see incorrectly set up. So a few basic principles to bear in mind are: it can be implemented in the head area of a page or in the sitemap, but generally we recommend implementing it in the head, because implementing it in the sitemap means that you have one single point of failure that can break the hreflang implementation for your whole website. Secondly, all existing language versions of the current page, including the current page itself, should be referenced. So the US page in my example on the right hand side here would contain an hreflang link to itself and to each of the other versions, so UK English, Canadian English, French Canadian, and German. It's important to note that while language must be specified, country is optional. So hreflang DE targets all German speakers regardless of the country that they're in. While if I want my French content to only target French Canadian users, I can specify the language FR and then the country CA. And likewise with the English versions, I can specify for which location my different English pages should be served. And it's usually a good idea to specify your X-default version, so the default version of your content that should be shown to users for whom a specific language version doesn't exist. And finally, only indexable pages should be referenced in your hreflang. So no URLs with a non-200 status code, no index pages, no pages that canonicalize to another page. The hreflang attribute is a tool to help Google to index and serve the correct content. So if we reference non-indexable pages in our hreflangs, it's going to confuse the search engines and may lead to some strange, undesired behavior in the SERPs. Aside from these basic best practice principles, one of the most common mistakes we see with hreflang implementation is missing return links. If the hreflang of page X refers to page Y, then the hreflang of page Y must refer back to page X. If this isn't the case, it can break the whole hreflang chain, and search engines may disregard the instructions for all pages in that hreflang chain. So a quick illustration of this: if we have 3 pages all in German, one for users in Germany, one for users in Austria, and one for users in Switzerland, in the correct implementation, all pages would reference one another. But if one of the pages is missing the return link, so in this example, if the Austrian page is missing a return link to the German page, this could break the hreflang implementation for all 3 pages. Search engines might not be able to correctly interpret which URL to show the users in these different countries, and this is why it's super important to make sure that your pages, which are available in multiple languages and countries, contain return links to all the other versions of the content, as well as the links back to themselves. Another common error that we see is the use of incorrect language or country codes. The language and country codes that you use in your hreflang have to conform to specific formats: ISO 6391 for languages and ISO 31661 Alpha 2 for countries. You can find the correct codes for all languages and countries at the Wikipedia articles that I've linked here. You should also bear in mind that codes for regions aren't supported, like the EU or specific continents. And it's also important to note that sometimes the language code doesn't necessarily match the country code, even in cases where a language is typically only associated with that one country. For example, the language code for Danish is DA, but the country code for Denmark is DK, and the language code for Czech is CS, but the country code for the Czech Republic is CZ. One of the more common hreflang code mix-ups that we see is a business has a page they want to target the Brazilian market with, so Brazilian Portuguese speakers in Brazil, so they add the hreflang BRBR. However, in the language code formats that we use for hreflang, BRBR doesn't mean Brazilian Portuguese speakers in Brazil, rather it means Breton speakers in Brazil, which is a much more niche demographic than the intended target group. The correct hreflang for Portuguese speakers in Brazil would be PTBR. Another really common one we see is a company that wants to target English speakers in the UK, so they use the hreflang EN-UK. However, the country code UK doesn't mean the United Kingdom. The hreflang EN-UK would actually be for English speakers in Ukraine, and the correct code for English UK would be ENGB. Now we know that getting the hreflang right is such an important part of your SEO strategy, but it's still something that a lot of companies are getting wrong. If we take a look under the hood of Nestlé's B2B website, for example, we can see that they're using the incorrect BR-BR codes to reference their Brazilian Portuguese website. Or if we take German fashion brand Outfittery as another example and have a look at their hreflang implementation, they're referencing their UK website with the incorrect code EN-UK for users in Ukraine. So this is really something that a lot of companies still have to work on. So when you're working out your international SEO strategy and you're defining your hreflangs, some of the important things that you should consider are ideally place it in the head rather than in the sitemap. Always reference the current URL and all alternatives, so there's no missing return links in there. You can use Screaming Frog to find any missing return links in your website. Just make sure that your crawl settings allow the bot to crawl hreflangs, and in the hreflang bit of the report section, you'll find the missing return links report. Always use the correct language and country codes, which is super important if you want the search engines to understand your international strategy properly. Only reference indexable URLs with your hreflangs. Again, Screaming Frog has a handy report to check for any non-indexable hreflangs as well. And specify your xdefault to tell search engines which version of the website to show if a specific language or location version isn't available. And just one final note on international targeting and serving the right content to the right users. It should be noted that IP-based redirects are not a good solution for this. The main reason for this is that, simply put, you shouldn't take the user somewhere that they haven't asked to be taken. There's plenty of reasons why a user might access a website targeting a country not matching the IP address that they're accessing it from. Perhaps they're on holiday, maybe they're using a VPN, but it can be really frustrating from the perspective of the user if you redirect them to a version other than the one they've requested. And for search engines, it can cause indexing issues. Googlebot usually crawls from the US, so if you're redirecting all US users, then Google might not be able to index your non-US content. John Mueller puts it simply that with IP redirects, it's easy to break indexing and frustrate users. And if our target markets include one of the few countries in which Google isn't the dominant search engine, we also need to make sure our website is optimized for the primary local search engine. In recent years, Google has overtaken local search engines that were previously the main player in several markets, for example, the Czech Republic and South Korea. So nowadays, we're mainly just talking about Baidu in China and Yandex in Russia. But these are still two huge markets, so if your international SEO strategy includes either of these countries, it's essential that you make sure your site meets any technical requirements to perform well on these search engines. For example, if you include links on your page to websites that are blocked in China, this is going to slow down those pages. It can happen that if you use the same navigation template in all markets and all countries, this template might include buttons linking to the social media pages for your business. And because Facebook and YouTube are blocked in China, if these appear on your Chinese pages, it's going to make your site load quite a bit slower. Local hosting in mainland China gives you a significant advantage if you're targeting that market. It can be pretty expensive and complicated to set up, but it may be worth it if you're serious about targeting Baidu. Or if you're targeting the Russian market, it's important to make sure that all of your important content is returned in HTML on the initial page load, because Yandex's crawlers aren't as sophisticated as Googlebot when it comes to handling JavaScript content. One final technical question that you may want to ask is which domain strategy is best for you. Realistically, this is something that you'd only consider if you're setting up a brand new website or if you were already planning a migration. But if you're in a position where you can influence what domain strategy will be chosen for a website, then it's worth considering the pros and cons of each type of setup for international SEO. The three main strategies are country code top-level domains, so individual domains per country using the specific country code, like .de for Germany, .pl for Poland, .fr for France, and so on. A generic top-level domain with language and/or country folders, So one generic top-level domain like .com or .net, and then /de/pl/fr, etc. Or a generic top-level domain with subdomains, so de.example.com, pl.example.com, and so on. The main unique advantage of using country code top-level domains is that the local country code, so the .co.uk, .de, .fr, carries a level of trust and local authority that can improve click-through rate. Although in an increasingly globalized world of e-commerce, it could be argued that this benefit will wane somewhat over time. On top of this, the ccTLD clearly signals to Google which country the domain is targeting, and you can set a local IP address for the domain. The biggest disadvantage of the ccTLD strategy is that you need to build up the authority of each domain individually. Scaling link building for X number of domains can be pretty resource heavy. Additionally, you may require more internal resources if you need to edit each domain individually, and more internal costs if you're paying more for hosting multiple domains. The big advantage of going for a generic top-level domain with subfolders, in contrast to the ccTLD solution, is that domain authority signals like backlinks are shared across folders. So the value of all of those links you build in that point to your domain is being shared across your different country folders. Often you have lower setup and maintenance costs if you're just working with one domain as opposed to multiple domains. Setting up tracking, for example, is much easier with just one domain than several. And geo-targeting in Search Console is possible. So if you set up Search Console properties for each subfolder, you can go to international targeting in the legacy tools and reports section of Search Console, and you can specify which country you want to target with that folder. There are a few disadvantages, so there's no local bonus on CTR. The generic top-level domains don't signal local relevance to search engines, and setting up of local IP addresses per folder isn't possible. Then finally, we come to the generic top-level domain with subdomains. In general, we wouldn't recommend going with subdomains if you have the option to use one of the other two solutions. While geo-targeting in Search Console is possible, and you can serve your individual subdomains via different IP addresses, there aren't really any unique advantages to the subdomain solution that you can't get with either subfolders or ccTLDs. And with subdomains, there's no local bonus as with the ccTLDs. The authority of each subdomain is considered separately by the search engines, so there's no pooling of authority as there is with subfolders, and generally there's a higher level of technical complexity compared to subfolders. So, to quickly recap the main points you should consider when developing a successful international SEO strategy. Without proper localization, you're probably not going to cover all the important topics and keywords for your target market, which means you'll miss out on potential customers. You should localize your keyword strategy if you want to really understand search behavior in your target market. Then use this information to localize your website and deliver a really local user experience. Your content should contain locally relevant keywords, and you should use the currency format, measurements, trust badges that your users in your target market expect to see. Make sure your hreflang is implemented correctly if you want search engines to show the right pages to the right users. If you're targeting international markets where search engines with specific technical requirements or limitations have a significant market share, make sure your website meets those requirements. And finally, if you're in a position to do so, for example a new website or a relaunch, pick the domain strategy that makes the most sense for your international strategy. Hopefully that gives you some helpful takeaways for your international SEO strategy. If you have any questions or you'd like to chat some more about international SEO, you're very welcome to reach out to me at james.mclaughlin@planeo.com. Thanks very much for listening.